before the fire, before the treasure. Erebor's halls were filled with darkness and whispers of an ancient curse long forgotten by the dwarves. The old elven text lay before them, its edges frayed with the passage of time. Gandalf's fingers hovered over the brittle pages, his sharp eyes scanning the words, each one heavier than the last. The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. The ancient library of Rivendell held many secrets, but this discovery was different. It was not a tale of heroism or glory, but of a truth long buried, a truth about Erebor. Legolas stood beside Gandalf, his face pale as he read the faded script over the wizard's shoulder. This, his voice was barely a whisper. This speaks of Erebor, but not in the way we know it. Gandalf nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the text. No, this is a different story. Before the treasure, before the dragon. Erebor's riches were not merely a product of dwarven craft. There was something darker beneath it all, something ancient and dangerous. Frodo, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, curiosity and unease, fighting for dominance in his chest. What do you mean, Gandalf? The dwarves have always said that Erebor's wealth was built through their toil. What could be darker than that? Gandalf's eyes flicked up, meeting Frodo's gaze. The dwarves of Erebor may have built their kingdom with their hands, but their wealth was never solely their own. It was bound to something far older, something darker than they ever realized. Erebor's treasure, its gold and gems, was not just a product of mining. It was a gift, a price paid in silence, tied to a curse that stretches back to Morgoth's time. Frodo's heart skipped a beat. Morgoth. But that was centuries ago, after the defeat of Angband. How could his influence still be here in Erebor? It was Morgoth's shadow that loomed over Erebor long before Smaug ever set foot there. Gandalf continued, his voice grave. The dragons of Erebor were not just beasts. They were servants of Morgoth, bred to guard his treasures, and Erebor was one of the places where his dark influence took root. Legolas stepped back, his mind racing. Dragons. But the first dragon was Smaug. He was the one who claimed Erebor. No, Gandalf's voice was firm. Smaug was the last. But Erebor's dragon problem began long before him, when the dwarves first dug too deep into the mountain. They unearthed more than treasure. They uncovered a curse, the legacy of Morgoth's dragons, bound to the mountain long before the dwarves ever knew it. Frodo's head spun. The history of Erebor was full of tales of treasure, heroism, and fire. But this was something different, a darkness that had been woven into the very bones of the mountain. But why hide this, Gandalf? He asked. Why did the dwarves not speak of it? The dwarves were not aware. Frodo, Gandalf replied softly. The truth was buried, and those who did know were silenced, either by fear or by the curse itself. But the elves, wise as they are, knew more than they shared. treasure of Erebor was never simply a gift of gold and jewels. It was tied to something much older, much darker. The dragons were not just creatures of fire. They were created by Morgoth, designed to protect his treasures and bind the dwarves to the same curse. Frodo felt a chill creep over him as the weight of Gandalf's words settled in. But why? Why would the dwarves agree to such a thing? Gandalf's eyes grew distant, as if seeing into a time long past. The dwarves did not understand what they were doing. Erebor was built on ambition, on the pursuit of wealth. In their hunger for riches, they opened the door to something they were never meant to awaken. Morgoth's influence seeped into the stone, and the dragons came not to destroy, but to guard. They were tied to Erebor, tied to the very land. The room seemed to grow colder as Gandalf spoke, as if the darkness of those ancient days was pressing closer, encroaching on the present. Frodo could almost feel the weight of Morgoth's curse in the air, a lingering shadow that refused to be forgotten. The dragons of Erebor were never just beasts of destruction, Gandalf said, his voice low. They were tools of Morgoth, and the treasure was but a means to an end. The dwarves' greed, their thirst for gold, led them to dig too deep, to awaken something that had been meant to sleep forever. Legola's voice broke the silence. The curse, it still lingers, doesn't it? Even after the fall of Angband. Yes, Gandalf said, his voice somber. Even now, Erebor's wealth is tainted. The shadow of Morgoth never fully left. Smaug was merely the final act in a much older drama, and now that he is gone, the echoes of the past are stirring once again. The air was thick with dust and the scent of ancient stone. The group walked cautiously through the halls of Erebor, the great kingdom of the dwarves. Though the stone had stood strong for centuries, an unsettling feeling lingered in the air, as though the very walls of Erebor were holding their breath. Gandalf led the way, his staff tapping against the ground in rhythmic intervals. Frodo, Legolas, and Dane Ironfoot followed, their footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the mountain. The further they ventured, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. It was subtle at first, a slight tremor in the ground beneath their feet, a flicker of movement in the corners of their eyes. But soon it became undeniable. The walls groaned, as though the mountain itself was waking, reacting to their presence. This place, Frodo murmured, his voice barely a whisper. It feels alive. Gandalf stopped, his gaze sweeping over the room. He had felt it too, the creeping sensation that something ancient and terrible was lurking just beneath the surface. Something is watching us, Gandalf said, his voice grave. The deeper we go, the more the mountain stirs. Erebor was never meant to be disturbed. Legolas, ever vigilant, furrowed his brow. What do you mean? The dwarves have mined here for generations. The dwarves may have mined here, Gandalf replied. But there are forces older than their craft beneath this mountain. Forces that should have remained buried. A faint, reverberated through the stone, and the floor beneath them trembled again, this time more pronounced. A shadow passed across the far wall, though no one was there to cast it. The air grew thick with the scent of sulfur. Strange, Legolas whispered, his voice laced with unease. I do not remember Erebor feeling like this when I last walked its halls. Dane Ironfoot, the dwarven representative in this company, said nothing at first. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his hand resting lightly on his axe. It's an old fear, this place, he finally spoke. The stories we told of Erebor's wealth, the glittering treasure hoard, the riches of gold. We never spoke of what the mountain was built upon, or what was hidden within it. What do you mean, Dane? Frodo asked, glancing at him. Dane's eyes grew distant, haunted by memories long buried. There were whispers among my ancestors, tales passed down in the shadows of the forges. Before the gold, before the jewels, Erebor's halls were already tainted. We never understood what we had uncovered, not until it was too late. Gandalf turned to face him, his expression solemn. What did your ancestors uncover, Dane? Dane hesitated, then lowered his voice. It's the dragons, isn't it? Erebor's wealth, its riches. They were tied to more than just gold and silver. They were tied to the dragons that Morgoth created, his very servants. It's in the old stories, the ones we never speak of. The dragons didn't just come from the east, they came from beneath. Frodo felt a shiver run down his spine. The dragons, he echoed. But they've been gone for centuries, since Smaug's time. Smaug was the last, Gandalf said, his voice dark. But Erebor's wealth, its treasure, it wasn't just about gold. It was tied to Morgoth's curse. The dragons didn't leave. They were bound to this mountain, guardians of a treasure meant to stay hidden. As Gandalf spoke, a distant rumbling grew louder, and the group stiffened. The tremors in the mountain's core seemed to echo through the vast halls. They could feel it now. The mountain was waking, and it was not happy to be disturbed. Legolas, his eyes narrowed, reached for his bow. We should move quickly, he said. The longer we stay, the more the mountain reacts. They pressed forward, following the narrow, winding path deeper into Erebor's heart. The air grew heavier with each step, the shadows deeper and more suffocating. As they descended, the old stories, the forgotten tales, began to take shape. Gandalf's voice, low and measured, filled the space. Morgoth, he began, the Dark Lord of the First Age, did not simply create dragons for conquest. He created them to guard treasures, treasures that should never have been claimed by mortals. But Erebor, he trailed off, his words heavy with the weight of history. Erebor was different. It was a place of great riches, but not all of them were of the earth. Some were stolen, created by Morgoth himself. Legolas, who had been walking quietly beside Gandalf, spoke. You're saying the dragons weren't just guardians. They were bound here by Morgoth's will. Gandalf nodded. Yes, Legolas, Erebor's treasure wasn't just gold, it was part of a pact with Morgoth. The dragons didn't just guard the wealth, they were a part of it, bound to the mountain itself. Frodo looked around at the dark stone walls, feeling the weight of Gandalf's words. It was as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, and every step they took brought them closer to something terrible. The deeper they went, the more the air became thick with foreboding. As they rounded a corner, they found themselves at the entrance to a vast chamber. The walls were covered with ancient carvings, dwarven runes, and elvish symbols, some faded and worn with age. But among them, there were other symbols, strange, twisted marks that sent a chill through Frodo's bones. "What are these?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "These," Gandalf said, his voice heavy, "are not dwarven or elvish. These are the marks of Morgoth's influence, symbols from the First Age, when Erebor was just beginning to rise. They were left here as warnings, reminders that the treasure of Erebor was never meant to be." The room felt like a tomb, and Frodo couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was holding them captive, waiting to reveal its dark secrets. Suddenly, the ground trembled again, this time stronger. The stone beneath their feet shifted, and a low growl reverberated through the walls. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, shadowy forms moving just out of sight. "Stay close," Gandalf urged. "We've disturbed something ancient." The group advanced deeper, following the twisting passageways, until they arrived at a chamber unlike any they had seen. In the center stood a massive stone pedestal, atop which lay an artifact, a dragon-shaped stone, etched with the same eerie symbols they had seen earlier. Gandalf stepped forward, his expression grim. "This," he said, his voice laced with dread, "is the key to Erebor's curse. It's a dragon-summoning artifact. Morgoth used these to bind his dragons to places like this. Erebor was never just a treasure trove. It was a prison, and these stones were used to control the dragons, to keep them from leaving." As Gandalf reached out to touch the stone, a violent tremor shook the chamber, causing the walls to crack and the ground to split. The air grew thick with heat, and a terrifying roar echoed from the depths of Erebor. The shadows in the room grew darker, and out of the corners of the chamber, dragon-like figures began to form, fiery eyes glaring from the shadows. The ancient evil that had slumbered for centuries was awakening. "We've unleashed something terrible," Gandalf whispered. "The dragons, they were never gone. They were just waiting." The roar echoed again, louder this time, and the shadows seemed to move toward them, growing larger with each passing moment. "We have to leave," Legolas said urgently, drawing his bow. But Gandalf stood still, staring at the stone pedestal, his face drawn with regret. "There is no leaving, not now. We must face what we've uncovered." The group braced themselves as the shadows converged, and the true horror of Erebor's past began to reveal itself in the form of ancient dragons, creatures bound to Morgoth's will, waiting to be awakened from their long slumber. The tremor that had shaken the chamber seemed to still the air for a moment, but beneath the silence, the oppressive weight of ancient power hung like a cloud. Gandalf stepped forward, his staff raised as he peered at the massive stone pedestal before them. The dragon-shaped artifact pulsed with a faint, eerie light, as though it had come alive with some dark force. The shadows that danced across the walls flickered, now alive with an almost palpable menace. This, Gandalf murmured, his voice low and strained, is no ordinary relic. Frodo, Legolas, and Dain stood close behind, their faces pale as they took in the sight of the ancient stone. The shape of the dragon seemed almost to writhe, its carved form shifting, as if it was still aware of their presence, watching them with glowing eyes. Gandalf, Frodo's voice trembled. What is it? What have we found? Gandalf turned to face the group, his eyes filled with regret. This stone is more than a symbol of power. It is a key to a long-buried secret. The dragons were not mere beasts, created for destruction. No, they were the guardians of Erebor's darkest secret. Morgoth's influence did not just shape them, it bound them to Erebor itself. Dain stepped forward, his axe gripped tightly in his hand, but he made no move to approach the stone. Guardians, he echoed. Guardians of what, Gandalf? Guardians of Morgoth's legacy, Gandalf replied gravely. When the dwarves first dug into Erebor's mountain, they unknowingly unearthed not just treasure, but a power tied to Morgoth's curse. The dragons were not created solely to guard gold and jewels, Dain. They were bound to the very mountain itself, bound to keep Morgoth's power alive. Legolas narrowed his eyes, sensing the depth of the danger. You mean to say that Erebor's wealth, its treasure, it was never meant to be just gold. It was part of something darker. Gandalf nodded. Yes, Legolas. The dragons were the first guardians, and their role was never just to protect material wealth. The treasure of Erebor, its gold, its gems, was part of a dark pact made long ago. A pact to keep the power of Morgoth alive, to keep the dragon summoning magic buried beneath the mountain. As Gandalf spoke, the air in the chamber grew thicker, charged with an energy that sent a shiver through everyone present. The shadows flickered again, and the low growl of something deep within the earth resonated through the walls. The sound, reverberating like the very bones of the mountain, were shifting. It was clear now that they had not just uncovered a simple relic, but the very source of Erebor's curse. The dragons, Gandalf continued, his voice grim, were not simply protectors of treasure. They were servants of Morgoth, created to bind Erebor and its inhabitants to his will. The treasure was never meant to be a gift. It was a price. The dwarves' greed, their pursuit of wealth, only fed the curse, awakening the ancient power that lay beneath. The group exchanged uneasy glances as they processed Gandalf's words. The wealth of Erebor, once thought to be a symbol of dwarven skill and prosperity had been something much more insidious. It had always been tied to the power of Morgoth, and by seeking it, the dwarves had unwittingly unleashed the curse that had been buried for centuries. "We've disturbed it," Legolas said softly, a note of fear in his voice. "We've awakened the curse that was meant to stay buried." "Yes," Gandalf answered, his voice heavy with regret. "But there is more to this story. Morgoth's dragons were never fully defeated. They were merely sealed away. Their influence lingers, and now that we have awakened them, now that we have uncovered this, there is no going back." Suddenly, the shadows in the chamber grew darker still, swirling around the group like an encroaching storm. The temperature in the room began to rise, the stone walls pulsing with an unnatural heat. The very mountain seemed to breathe with a slow, ominous rhythm, and the floor beneath them trembled once again. "Get back," Gandalf shouted, raising his staff high. The group retreated, their eyes wide with fear as the air grew thick with an oppressive force. The shadows on the walls began to shift, and glowing eyes appeared, eyes that seemed to burn with the fury of ancient dragons. "We must leave," Frodo said, his voice shaking. "Now, Gandalf." Gandalf did not answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the shadows, which seemed to shift and writhe with a malevolent force. The chamber had come alive with darkness, and the air crackled with an energy that made the hairs on Frodo's neck stand on end. Gandalf, however, was transfixed by the stone pedestal at the center of the room. "It's too late to leave now, Frodo." Gandalf's voice was quiet, yet filled with a cold understanding. "We've awakened something far worse than we imagined." As the words left Gandalf's mouth, a deep, guttural growl filled the chamber. The dragon-shaped artifact began to pulse with an unnatural light, and the stone doors of the chamber began to groan as if they were coming to life. A low rumble filled the air, followed by a high-pitched hiss that seemed to resonate in the very marrow of their bones. The ground beneath their feet trembled as the dragon's spirits, bound to Erebor for centuries, began to stir. Suddenly, from the depths of the mountain, a voice ancient and terrible rumbled through the stone. It was the sound of something that had lain dormant for an eternity, waiting for the moment to rise again. "The curse has been awakened, and the dragons will return." The ground continued to tremble beneath their feet as the echoes of the dragon's roar reverberated through the mountain. The very walls of Erebor seemed to shudder, and the shadows, which had once seemed distant, now felt as though they were closing in. Gandalf stood tall, his staff glowing with a faint light, yet even he felt the weight of what had been unleashed. The group retreated quickly, moving back down the narrow corridors they had come through. The tremors had subsided, but the danger remained. They had discovered the truth. Erebor's wealth was tied to something far older and darker than gold or jewels. It was bound to Morgoth's will, and the dragons were the living guardians of that legacy. As they reached the exit, Gandalf were meant to remain buried forever. And now we have awoken something that may never be undone. Frodo, feeling the weight of Gandalf's words, looked back at the mountain. The sky above had darkened, the stars obscured by swirling clouds. The trembling of the earth beneath their feet had not ceased. It was as though Erebor itself was alive, feeding off the chaos they had stirred. The darkness is spreading, Legolas whispered, his gaze drawn to the shadows that seemed to stretch across the land. The curse of Morgoth's dragons has never truly been broken. No, Gandalf replied softly, his voice filled with a deep, mournful sorrow, and it will haunt Middle-earth, perhaps forever. As they made their way back to Rivendell, the world seemed darker. The legacy of Erebor, once thought to be merely a tale of treasure, was far more sinister. The curse that had been buried in the heart of the mountain was awakening once again, and Middle-earth would never be the same. The earth trembled beneath their feet, and the stars above seemed to dim, as if bearing witness to the legacy of Morgoth's evil, a legacy that continued to haunt Middle-earth's darkest corners. The price for seeking the truth had been paid, but the consequences would ripple through the ages.